Good morning, everybody, and welcome. You are a select few high-quality individuals joining us this morning, and you're very welcome. I'm sure we'll get a few more people coming into the room in the next few minutes. Traffic problems and parking problems and all the rest of it. Welcome also to the online audience, which is slightly larger than the physical audience. No, it's about the same, actually. Yeah, right. We're not going to worry about numbers. This event is being recorded and it's going to be made available on various platforms afterwards, including on News 24, where thousands of people will have access to the ideas and the points of discussion, the general wisdom that we have here in the room. Let me introduce everybody to start with. My name's Mike Pothier. I am the Program Manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and we are co-hosting this event this morning with the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. We are in their premises in the old granary building in Cape Town, and also co-hosting with our sponsors, the Hans Seidel Foundation, and with News 24. On the panel, we have Adrian Basson, the Editor-in-Chief of News 24, and Adrian will be our kind of first and main speaker on the topic. And then we've asked three people to join the panel, to give responses, to deal with various questions that arise, either from Adrian's input or generally from the topic. And those people are Janet Jobson, who is the director of the Tutu Legacy Foundation, Sune Payne, next to me here, a political journalist with the Daily Maverick, and then Moira Levy, who is the production manager of the Institute for African Alternatives, but also, can I call you a veteran journalist? Very active in journalism back in the 1980s and the 90s and the struggle days and the states of emergency, etc. We've particularly asked Moira to join us to say something about the differences in the media landscape and in the political media interface from those days to where we find ourselves now. So I'm not going to go into much further ado before I hand over. Just the one thing that we always do. Ourselves being a faith-based organization, we invite people to take a minute just to compose themselves, to invoke the Holy Spirit on this meeting, or simply to, so I always say, remind yourselves why you took the trouble to join us this morning. So just a few seconds. Thank you. Thanks very much. So the format will be that Adrian will start us off. We're not going to have 4 speeches. We're going to have one main input and then a discussion. And I'd invite all of you who are watching this online to feel free to place your comments and your questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we will attend to them as we go through the course of the discussion. So Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the warm introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here to see you all. Election season is extremely exciting for me. I'm a total election nerd, so I get very excited at the prospect of next year's election. I love the results, the data, the dynamics, and specifically when it gets close, as it seemingly is going to be next year in at least 3 or 4 elections. But this morning we're turning the mirror to ourselves for a while on the media's role in covering the elections, and I'll just start with some introductory remarks before we go into our discussion. I think the media's role in elections doesn't differ fundamentally from the media's role in general. So I still believe in the 3 core pillars of the role of the media, which is to inform, which is to educate, and then to delight. I guess the delight takes a step back when it comes to elections, and I want to replace that with investigate for this election specifically, because I believe we no longer can only report on elections and everything to do with it, but we actually have to investigate some aspects of it, which I'll go to in a bit. So starting with inform, I think we all understand what inform means. We have to cover elections. All of us, Sinead's newsroom, myself, my team will be out in full force all over the country. We'll be covering the campaigns, we'll be covering the election day, and then obviously the results and what happens afterwards. An unfortunate reality is that having followed the shrinking of newsrooms over the past 2 decades, unfortunately, I think this will be the first election since 1994, or the election since 1994 with the least amount of journalists out in the field. We've seen many newsrooms shrinking or being shut down during COVID. We've recently, in the past 2 weeks, saw independent media and Arena, two of the second and the third largest media houses in the country, issuing retrenchment notices to large amount of staff again. So we will have less journalists in the field, which is unfortunately a sign of the times. It speaks to the implosion or the massive disruption in the economy of news, which is maybe another topic we can talk about another day. It speaks to the fact that there are just simply less advertising available to digital media as they were in the years of print, and also that the uptick of subscriptions, digital subscriptions, are not yet at a point where it is sustainable to a number of publications to thrive. So this election comes at a time when the media is hugely under pressure and when resources are stretched. In terms of the election coverage, I think it's a duty of the media to report on the manifestos of the different parties. And I'm very happy that next year there'll be a bit of a bigger menu, so to speak, when we go to the ballot box. The traditional parties will be there, the ANC, the DA, the EFF, the IFP, but there were also quite new faces on the block. And I think it's the duty of the media to report on these new players. And maybe I can talk about that while I spoke about them. So we often get accused that we are disproportionately covering the likes of Songezo Zibi, Herman Mashaba from Action SA, and also Musi Mamane and some other new players. Zaki Ahmed has announced he will be an independent candidate. I don't agree with that view. I think that the media, the independent media specifically, well, let me start by saying the SABC is legally bound to give coverage to parties represented in parliament. So for the SABC, there's no two ways about it. They simply have to cover the parties who are represented in parliament and give them proportional coverage proportional to their representation in parliament. But for the rest of us, it's up to us how we cover these parties. Now, I think it's responsible to cover the main parties, and we'll talk about the EFF a bit later because I have a proviso there. But I think it's our duty to cover the main parties. But I also think, and I'm very comfortable with my platform News24 covering the new players on the block, because I think we are going through political change. I think this is going to be a crossroads election. It's been said many a times. It's become a bit of a cliche, but all the polls are showing at the moment that the ANC is likely to dip under 50 for the first time in 30 years, which makes it a real big election. And I think the fact that there may be a coalition government that may consist of some of these small parties with the ANC or with other players makes it very interesting to know who they are. Who is Songezo Zibi and Rais Mzansi? Why are they launching a party? What do they mean when they say, they're bringing a new type of politics because, the old type of politics only benefits the politicians? Why is Mashaba seemingly so popular in Gauteng, specifically in Johannesburg? He's got a bit of proven results behind him in the 2021 local government election in Joburg, where he got about 17%. Action SA. But I think it's also our duty to report on these new players in the political circle. Zaki Ahmed is the by far the highest profile independent candidate who's put up his hand, but there's going to be many more independents who's running in their communities. And it's our duty, I think, as the media, and I don't particularly think we've done a great job of explaining to our readers so far exactly how this will work. We will all get 3 ballots next year. Do people know what the third ballot is about? I don't think so. And I think we have to do more trouble in explaining this before the election. Okay, so let's go to the tricky one, covering of rallies and major political parties. So what we have learned, well, what I particularly have learned through the Trump years, and also locally, is that there is an inherent risk in taking a live feed from political rallies by politicians who tend to lie. And you might chuckle at that because all politicians has got that habit. But we, unfortunately, in South Africa, particularly have one party, the EFF, who is prone to uttering hate speech and disinformation from public platforms. Now, there's an inherent risk in taking those feeds live because you can't tell your reader or your viewer at that moment that this is in fact not true. So what we have decided in our newsroom is that we will not take all rallies from all political parties live at all times. There's a risk in doing that. We will record them and we will report on them, certainly. But we think it's better to slow down that process just a step and be able to fact check what comes out of there. And that goes to my point of investigate. I simply think the days of covering politicians' speeches uncritically is over. I don't think we'll be doing our jobs as journalists just to uncritically repeat what politicians are saying. When they make bold claims involving statistics, for example, you have to simply fact check that because, as we have seen in this era of disinformation and fake news, people literally just talk a lot of crap sometimes and get away with it. I also think that look, the ANC will undoubtedly get the majority of the coverage, and that makes sense. They are still the governing party, the majority party. But I think the tone and the approach of the ANC will be different this time because of what the polls are showing us. And I'm very glad that at least the ANC is now engaging with that prospect of going below 50, of having to form a coalition government. About a year or, end of last year when we went to Germany with our friends at Hans Seidel Foundation, the ANC was not part of coalition discussions. And I came back from Germany saying, well, this is like the biggest anomaly in our coalition's world, is that the majority party isn't part of the coalition discussions. It was always the opposition ganging up on the ANC. And I think in the past few months, we see a sea change in that. We've seen the ANC entering that discussions. We've heard people like Fikile Mbalula, the Secretary General, saying we might go as low as 40%. We've seen symposiums being held at the campus of the University of the Western Cape, where Paul Mashatile, the Deputy President, was chairing a session on coalition forming and what has to change in terms of legislation, thresholds, etc. So at least the ANC, and I think this is very good for democracy. I think this is a hugely positive sign that the majority party, who's been in government for 30 years, is now part and parcel of the discussion about a future coalition government. This was unthinkable a few years ago. I think we should pause and respect the moment. A few years ago, in fact, not so long ago, the ANC got 69% of the national vote in a national election. I can't exactly remember if it was 2004. I think it was 2004. So, I mean, this is a party that if they go to just around 50 or just below, this is 20% drop. This is massive. And I think we have to respect the moment. And I'm not one of those, I'm not one of those people who fear the ANC losing power. I think the fact that the ANC is now part of the discussion, they're part of the structure, they're part of the institution of coalitions, they're talking about it, they're participating in the legislative changes that has to happen, is a very good thing for our democracy and a positive sign. I think just lastly, in terms of the informed part of our job, I think we have to report on the results in a data-savvy way. So the data is tricky. There's a lot of data available to us when we cover elections. I love sitting there during the night and just throwing those spreadsheets. But we're going to have to be very careful because it's so close next year on how we report on data and not kind of call things too soon. And then lastly, I think on coalition governments, we all had to shape up our knowledge on coalitions, how they work, how they are formed, how they collapse. And I think we're going to have to be, again, sharp on that in reporting. You know, a province like KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng specifically could go very likely into a coalition government next year, with or without the ANC. And we're going to have to spell out all those permutations. In terms of educate, we still have to do that. I think the new electoral system, I've spoken about that. I mean, it's hugely frustrating that it's still in the Constitutional Court, actually, and that there's no final word yet. But at some point, the court's going to have to draw a line and say, well, we have an election next year. So we're probably going to have to go with what we have at the moment. That's my suspicion, which is this province to national. We don't have a constituency system yet, so the constituencies will be the provinces. So we will all get a thick book when we go to vote with all those independent candidates in the Western Cape that we will see. So someone like Zaki Ahmad's name will also be in the ballot paper in Beaufort West and Oudtshoorn and Nice, although he really is from here and wants to represent this constituency in Parliament. So, I mean, the system isn't perfect, but I think we have to explain that the fact that we're going to have 3 ballots. The threshold conversation is fascinating. I don't think we're going to have finality before next year's election, but at least it started where globally there's thresholds for parties to have representation in the legislature. So in countries like Germany, I think it's 5%, which is quite high. Other countries, it's as low as 1%. And the discussion here was 1% as well, to say parties below 1% support shouldn't actually have a seat in Parliament because it's very disruptive to coalition governments. But I don't think we will get finality on that position before next year's election. It is interesting, though, that the ANC and the DA agree on that point of 1% threshold. I've spoken about new parties. I think we have a responsibility to write about them, not about these crazies. So sorry, but there's like these fly-by-night parties. There was one the other day in my inbox. I was just like, these people are wasting their money. But I mean, like, you know, so I think look critically at the new parties who launch. But there's going to be lots of them, and there's always your kind of kiss parties who, you know, are kind of worth a bit of a laugh and a chuckle, but are not going to do anything. Or the purple pigs, what were they? The purple cows, sorry, last time. And then maybe just two more things. Investigate, I think, political party funding. I think it's been a great change for our country to now see that the funds being declared by the political parties through the IC. We've seen now, we know that the manganese mine that is co-owned by a Russian oligarch is the ANC's main funder now. And I've just published a book with my colleague Juanita Hunter called Who Will Rule South Africa, and we actually make the case in that book that the ANC support of Russia is actually quite simple to explain if you understand that deal. But it's good to know that, although I would say the big flaw in that is the parties who don't declare. And the EFF is number one on that list. The EFF just simply don't declare their donations. They've declared a few, but there's no way, for example, they could host that rally at FNB Stadium with the amounts of money they've declared. So there's a gap of money that does not get declared. You know, how do we investigate that? And I think we should. I think we should go hard in there. I think it's not only our responsibility, but our duty to fact check and call out lies and claims during election campaigns. And this is going to be the hard one, because it's much harder for a journalist to have to go out now to a rally and not only write your story, but fact check everything that politician had said. You know, we simply cannot just take it for granted or at face value anymore. And I'm thinking of setting up a little fact check data desk in the office for elections, just to people, you know, if the political reporters are in the field, for them to phone the office and say, or just quick WhatsApp and say, please check this fact, you know, unemployment numbers, for example, who owns the economy, who owns the land, that stuff will come up time and again. Potential voter fraud, voting role, independent candidates. I think we have to investigate that. Online registration is now, I think, is the first election that we have online registration. So it's going to be very interesting to see what that does to the turnout and the percentage of people who vote. And then lastly, on the investigation, the IEC, I still believe from my own personal interaction and experience of the IEC that it is a hugely professional, independent, and strongly safeguarded organization. I trust the IEC. I know a lot of the people in there who works with the data on the IT side, and these are absolute world-class professionals. But obviously, during the state capture years, what we've learned is that no institution is above attempts at least to capture. So we're going to have to keep close tabs on what's happening at the IEC, the individuals involved, and just stay close to the action. And lastly, Mike, you've asked me to just maybe talk about media freedom. I think we have great media freedom that we should celebrate every day in South Africa. We can write what we like. We can go anywhere and cover any political rally. But I am worried about KZN for next year. I've already heard from colleagues in the province that there is growing tension, especially in the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal, where the IFP has made a huge comeback in by-elections and where it's going to really be on the knife's edge who takes the province. Unfortunately, we all know the sad history of political violence in KZN, and we're going to have to be careful how we deploy colleagues there. I also think we've seen, volatile service delivery protests all over the country in recent years, and we're just going to have to be mindful when these protests happen around election day, how we deploy. I think we need to train our journalists on the new electoral system. I'm not sure we've done enough in that space. I know Sanef is now busy with a new program to get that done. And then lastly, should media houses endorse political parties? No. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adrian. We will come back to a lot of those points. I'm going to put my first question to Sune, just building on what Adrian has said about coverage. You're also sitting in a newsroom. Daily Maverick is a slightly different operation, I guess, from News 24, because you are doing more of the kind of analytical coverage and not just sort of immediate reporting on things. But you, as an organization, would still be having certain principal positions about how you decide who to cover, how to cover them, how to balance your coverage between the different parties and characters that are out there. Tell us a bit about those decisions.
So we've had discussions within our newsroom about the elections, where we cover, why exactly we are covering. And I think one of the nicer parts about working at Daily Maverick is you can ask questions. Why are we covering this organization? Why are we sending someone, for example, to Beaufort West to cover a rally by a political leader? I think that I am quite fortunate enough. I've been covering all the by-elections in the Western Cape, and they've been very, very interesting. I can say, look, there is a by-election in Witzenberg where Good is tipped to beat the DA, and actually that didn't happen, and it enhanced our reporting to actually be there at that time. And I think that's one of the nicer things about Daily Maverick. You can actually say, hey, I would like to do this. We've been seeing all the data, we've been seeing the comments online. Let's go there. Let's see what people can do. And it has actually been quite beneficial. I think in July it was the by-election in George, and it was very, very tense. I mean, Adrian, you spoke about the IEC being very professional. We got to the voting station, and if you don't know the background of that particular by-election, it was a close race between the DA, Good, and the Patriotic Alliance. We got to the voting station, and the IEC official said, hey, please go stand outside the voting station, go outside onto the road, because the political parties are very, very, very tense at the moment. And that was a bit shocking. I informed my editors, and they were like, okay, let's just add a line in the story to say it was a tense situation.
Janet, from civil society's point of view, how do you see the performance? How does it strike you, this question of coverage? Is it being done in a way that you feel is fair? Do you sometimes get perhaps a little bit kind of frustrated with the same people appearing too often on the front pages or on the screen of whatever online sources you follow and so on? What's your overall take on it?
Thanks, Mike. It's interesting, Adrian. Don't endorse political parties, but Yes, sure. No problem. Thank you. So don't endorse political parties, but I think media needs to endorse democracy. And one of the things that educate role, I think, is undervalued in the media space. So yes, people don't know what the third ballot is for. They don't know what the first and the second ballot are for. There's very little understanding of the difference between the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, very little understanding that this is not a presidential election, it's a parliamentary election, that what you're voting for is a seat in parliament. And so particularly with the budget cuts of the IEC, which have been dramatic, I think there's a really powerful role that media needs to play in enhancing civic education and enhancing voter education. Next weekend is the big registration drive, and I would hope every single media house has something on their websites, has something in print that really gets people to their voting stations next weekend or to the online portal, because critical to this election will be the participation, particularly of young people. And I think we can't underestimate what a platform media houses do have in reaching people. Obviously, most people reached by the SABC, that would be where most people will get their information. But I think there is a significant role to play from the independent media side of things. And then it's interesting in the Elections Code of Conduct, it speaks about free and fair elections also being determined by the atmosphere of the election. And I think there's an enormous role of the media in contributing to the atmosphere of the election. In particular, I think there is a need for media to be biased towards human rights. So we are going to see the mobilization of divisive rhetoric, particularly what we've already seen, xenophobic rhetoric. I think that will increase with particular parties. And I think there's a real need for media houses to look very carefully at themselves as to how you report on these very sensitive topics where actually there is the mobilization of hate. And we need to be very, very cognizant of whether we're just repeating the talking points of politicians that are using populist rhetoric, or whether we're actually informing with a bias towards an atmosphere of human rights and an atmosphere of broader accountability than just fact checking necessarily. And then I do think the in-depth analysis is critical. And we don't follow, it's one thing to report on a current manifesto. It's another thing to look back over time and to really chart some trends of what has been promised over time and what has been delivered. And I think that kind of analysis is really, really powerful for the public to get a better sense of actually, we are voting for a manifesto, but we're also not voting just for a manifesto. You are voting for a party to deliver in Parliament in particular ways. So those are my initial thoughts about the role of media.
Thank you. Moira, you don't have to only speak about the past. Feel free to comment on all of this, but I do want you to say a few words to start with about what strikes you as the main differences between how the media covered politics and political questions, let us say during the 1980s, state of emergency, no democracy, country in crisis in various ways, and how it is now. What are the contrasts that jump out at you?
Thanks, Mike. That's an interesting question. And I think it needs to be recognized that, in fact, the country is in crisis now as it was in 1994. And I think the election that's coming up next year is probably as important, if not maybe more important than the 1994 election. It's going to be most as critical. That was a turning point for our country. And I see another turning point arising in this pending election. And I think there's a need to address this next year's election in a new and innovative way. So I'm really pleased to hear what the journalists on the panel are saying. because I like the idea of Sunni's newsroom saying, we can ask questions. We can say, what should we cover? We should challenge our newsrooms. We should say where we think we should be covering and paying attention. I like the idea of what Adrian's saying about fact checking. It's going to be a whole different story this year. I think these are big differences that we're going to have to take into account. One of the biggest differences coming up now is the role of social media and the presence of social media. It's going to be an actor in this election, and it's going to be a rival to the commercial and independent media, a very serious rival, because they're not going to be fact checking. So, answer to your question, Mike, that wasn't a crisis in 1994. That was something that really has to be addressed, and the media has to be able to counter what's coming up on social media by strong, researched information. I think that's quite important. The other thing is a similarity with 94 is that was, if you recall, well, I recall, maybe there's some people also recall, at that election, it was necessary to do a lot of voter education. Because the majority of voters were voting for the first time. It was I was with the Institute for, IDASA, Institute for Democracy in South Africa. In fact, then it was still called a democratic alternative. That was before we got a democratic alternative in government. And IDASA was very involved in voter education. And I wonder how the voter education we're talking about now is urgent. I don't even understand this. I don't understand the three ballots. And I feel a very a challenge going into that poll, going into that ballot box, and making a really considered opinion. When all I know at the moment is that there are apparently going to be three ballots. People are laughing about the length of the ballot paper. Like, we're going to trail. I don't know. We're going to print it into a book with a spine and a hardcover. Might become necessary. I don't know any of these upstart parties. And I'd like to have an alternative, a real alternative, because I think this election actually offers an opportunity to not vote for the ANC or not the ANC. This is the big difference in 2024. And I think it's an opportunity we should be able to take full advantage of as voters. Mindful always of the threats and challenges that coalition government presents to our country, and we're seeing the evidence of that in local government sphere at the moment. I think in that way, the education of the voters becomes all the more important, and especially as was pointed out now, the apathy among voters is a very serious crisis happening all over the world, and it's particularly among the youth. Now, I work for a project at Institute for African Alternatives called In Defense of Our Constitutional Democracy. It's acronym, because everyone must have an acronym in South Africa. Its acronym is DECODE. And we recently we're trying to address the youth, to say to them, well, we thought we'd get youth groups in, and we say to them, are you going to vote? Why aren't you going to vote? And it was quite interesting with the first few discussions we had. The youth are definitely going to vote, and they see themselves as quite active, but they're skeptical about the elections as the sphere of parliament, of politics and of decision making. And I think we need to mobilize around that, because actually we must remember that the elections aren't the actual sphere of political mobilization. The election comes and goes. What happened before it and what happens after it is where the real work where the work is, because our democracy is going to maybe face all sorts of new challenges after 2024, say in the form of a coalition government, and it's going to still face all the existing challenges and crises. They're not going anywhere. The seventh parliament is going to take up their seats in exactly the same conditions, thanks to the rather lethargy of the Constitutional Court and the determined slowness of the ruling party in passing any radical legislation. Those problems are going to still be there. And I think we mustn't make the mistake of thinking after elections, the job is over. It's so not over. That's where the work really happens. And that's where I think our media comes into play. And as it always has done, without our phrase, just to say our thingy, our slogan at DECODE is, if Parliament doesn't work, democracy cannot work. And I think we have to remember that. We have to keep Parliament and democracy going, and voting going, but also much more than that, to keep our democracy, which is really under threat at this point. I think that's all I say for now.
Thank you, Moira. Anyone's free to put up their hand at any time and pose a question, and online audience as well, you're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A. The thing about media freedom, it's encouraging to hear what Adrian said about the media freedom in our country, and I know that we are presently ranked, I think, one spot above the United Kingdom in the International Press Freedom Index, and many spots above the United States, just to take two countries who would, I think, claim to be very media free. We do better than most, and we're very highly ranked in the world. Number 23, I think, out of 180 odd countries that are measured. But I think also what Sune has just said, I mean, one example of where, trying to cover a by-election and you are told as a journalist, you better move away because there's tension here between political parties. One of your colleagues, and I can't remember who it was, fairly recently, I think, had their camera or their cell phone taken and images wiped off or deleted. Was it by police or by Standard Bank security? That's right. But it's happened with police as well. Police telling journalists you can't take photographs of a situation when we know that they're entitled to. We've seen one or two journalists being manhandled a couple of years back outside Parliament by a senior member of one of the parties and so on. I'll come to you first, Sune. Is it as rosy as all of that, or do you think that being a journalist reporting on the ground around electoral and political issues does sometimes carry some risk?
It depends on where you find yourself. Often, in many situations, I am the only woman at a by-election. And that in itself is difficult because you get some people that make, oh yeah, are you really a journalist because you're young? Or, oh yeah, you're a girl, right? Oh, you look so pretty. You're too pretty to be a journalist. And those kinds of comments you can fluff away. But then there are sometimes threats. Oh, you need to leave now. You need to go home, or you just need to get out of here. I recall once a colleague and I had gone to a voting station the day before during a special vote, and it was about 6 p.m. and the police were driving around the area and they noticed our cameras and they said, oh, you two are girls. You need to leave. This is a dangerous area. And I'm like, what? Why? Until we actually drove out and we realized, we checked the crime stats of the area. This area is known to be unsafe. And sometimes you think, okay, yeah, because you're a journalist, you have that added layer of protection. But we forget South Africa is a violent country. Whether you live in a rural area or an urban area, it is a violent country, and we have risks associated with that. So yes, there are times when it's okay to just walk to interviews with your camera equipment out, but there are other times when you just need to leave. If your colleagues are leaving an area that you have just gone to, leave with them. Don't stay. Come back tomorrow or something. If it's dark, go. No story is worth your life,
Yeah, thank you. Another interesting point is that, yeah, sure.
This would be. I'm really interested to hear what Sune is saying, because she's the current generation of journalists, and I'm maybe the previous generation. I can bring my old age to bear here, maybe. The interesting thing for me listening to this is comparing 1994 to 2024. Is the threat? You said unsafe. It's unsafe. And it suddenly strikes me that what means unsafe in South Africa now means something very different in 2024. If you remember, in 2024, we were very nervous in the voting at the voting stations. Sorry, sorry, just lost track of my thought there. Thanks. It was scary because the run up to those elections had been so violent. There'd been so much conflict within the country. It was really touch and go at some point. Remember that Buthelezi, in Carter, only came at the very, very last minute. In fact, I happened to be in possession of, and I don't want to say how I came in possession of, but I happened to have a piece of the first original democratic voting ballot, which I've framed and I've put up on the wall, and there were some wacky parties at that time as well. But it's a good reminder, and I just remember the tension of those times and whether we're going to pull it off, and the absolutely amazing sensation when we actually did. And there was no overt violence. We were safe, and we were all South Africans coming together, and that created for us, I think, the atmosphere of the early days of our democracy. Unsafe now means something completely different. It means about crime and violence created or the result of the poverty, the desperation, the lack of delivery of our present government. We are a country beset with violence for reasons that this government has failed us. This ruling party has failed us, and that's one of the causes of this terrible crisis that we face. And I'm really sorry to hear that is something that the journalists have to be mindful of. May I just say, I wasn't one of them, but I used to cover all the protests in the 1980s. I used to make sure that I was very far behind or very mapped on the edge of the crowd because I was not very courageous, and I was often kind of ducking out and going into toilets just to get out of the line of fire. But I was one of the failed journalists in that respect, but I used to be amazed. From a safe point of view, at some distance, I used to observe the journalists. No one ever left a story. No one ever left a story. Whatever the story that was more important than your life. It was a different time then. And I think the threat was the security police and the army. That was the real danger, and they were very, very, very dangerous. But this is a whole different kind of personal areas are too dangerous to go into kind of story. So that is quite a serious and significant difference between then and now. And I think the threat that it poses to the media's role now, and is not only confined to the election, because that suggests, as Asuna, your story about the Standard Bank furore outside the Standard Bank when the environmental protest took place. I mean, that actually is a real threat to media freedom, and it comes to the point you're saying it's very nice to see us on this so high up on this list, but does this list take into account the kind of security threats that all a journalist face on the ground? Because I think that is a real challenge to media freedom, and I don't know if we would be so high on the list if those kind of threats were taken into account. Just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. I'm going to come to a couple of Q&A questions in a moment, but I just wanted to go back to one point Adrian made, that this is going to be the lowest number of active journalists covering an election since 1994 because of the shrinking of size of newsrooms and so on. Is it possible that the rise of and the use of social media somehow compensates for that? What I mean is, if I want to know what Steenhuisen, Malema, anybody else for that matter is saying and what their party stands for, etc., I don't have to wait for a journalist to tell me. I can go onto a website, I can follow them on X or Facebook or whatever. Does that somehow compensate for the decline in the traditional media newsroom?
Yes and no. So it's good it's obviously nice to have access to the thoughts of, political and other leaders in society. And I think that's one of probably one of the few good benefits of a platform like X, formerly known as Twitter, is to have access to those thoughts and views of political leaders and others. I think, Mike, where it becomes dangerous, and what I have personally noticed, is that I think almost most of our big political parties now think that they no longer need us. They can control the narrative through their social media platforms. So they use YouTube, they use, the DA's even got their own studio with like their own broadcasts and stuff. So this is a new world. And again, I link this back to Trump, because I think Trump was the first politician to actively, aggressively go against mainstream media and say, I don't need you. I have my own platforms. And I have seen some of those trends spilling over to South Africa. We have to counter that. We have to counter that with good reporting, with on the ground boots reporting, and with fact checking. So I think, it is good to have access to those views, but there's also this danger where not only them, but also their followers start these false narratives, often based on lies, that then gets perpetuated and repeated over social media. I mean, that's the power of social media, right? Is where a lie gets repeated and becomes truth. And I think that's where we have to step in and we have to monitor. We are actually in the moment speaking to some of the people who work on those disinformation social media campaigns to just see what we can do smarter next year with the election, because there's going to be a lot of that. I mean, it's not a secret that Russia, for example, is very involved in many elections in Africa through social media bots, misinformation. We haven't found proof of that yet here with this round, but I mean, it's completely in the realm of possibility that those kind of deep fake or campaigns, ops can be happening in the background.
Thank you. Janet, there's a question here which you might be able to start answering. Asking whether this is all should be less about the big name players in politics and more about understanding the issues facing communities, especially in rural areas and I guess other marginalized communities whose concerns often go underreported. In your experience, again, in working in civil society, are you finding that there are those areas of concern that affect people which are not being taken up and, if you like, mediated to the politicians through the media? Is it an issue?
I mean, I think in general, we don't pay enough attention to what's really, really happening on the ground, as one might put it, in South Africa. And I think what's particularly interesting when I think about the voter education role that the media has to play is being able to dissect for people the difference between the spheres of government. What are we actually engaged in for this election? And how does a local government challenge fit into that context? I think there's just a depth of knowledge about our democracy that isn't being filtered through to the public in general, and that the media could focus far more on. I do think there's something incredibly powerful about the spotlight effect that the media has. You know, if the media turn their attention onto local issues or even provincial issues in a really powerful way, it would evoke a response from the politicians. And I think there is something really important to think about what issues are being covered and why, and how do you get that spotlight on it in order for the politicians to respond. I think it's similar to, you know, just picking up on the social media, had an engagement a few months ago, and there'd been some really interesting analysis about social media in the Kenyan elections. And basically what they found is that unless there was a massive effort to get the social media companies to pay attention to the particularities of a particular election, they just don't notice it. And so the disinformation and misinformation runs rampant and there's no moderation. And so part of what we can do is use the powerful voice of the media and the powerful voice of civil society in partnership with the media to shine the spotlight, to really make sure that we're paying attention to all of the dynamics of an election, and in particular the mis and disinformation and the experience of local communities.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you've mentioned earlier the issue of xenophobia, and I think that's going to have to be a main focus of us. It's very clear to me from last week's announcements by Cabinet that immigration and foreigners is going to be a main huge ticket for parties to campaign on next year. And unfortunately, we live in a xenophobic country, and the parties have realized that. I think Mashaba was the first one, but the ANC is very much copying. I mean, I don't know if any of you, many of you saw, we reported on it on News 24, but there was last week the Cabinet announced measures to now basically I mean, this reminds me of very bad old days. Like, so spaza shops has to be on a register. They're going to inspect spaza shops. Traditional leaders are going to be entrusted to keep a register of the foreigners living in their areas. I mean, does this sound like democracy and constitutional state to you? I don't think so. So I think that issue, and that is a very tough one to cover because, like I said, unfortunately, we have, because of widespread poverty and unemployment and perceptions around, foreign nationals, we have xenophobia in our community. So to report that is hard. Second one, I think, to bring it close to home for everyone is load shedding. I mean, we've basically, we didn't have a lot of load shedding recently. We're now kind of back there again a bit, and that's, we're lucky to live in Cape Town. We have a bit less, but I mean, why? Well, how is it possible that a few months ago we had stage 6 every day, and now in the run-up to elections we have very little? I mean, this isn't a coincidence. So I think those are some of the issues that, those are just two that's come to mind, Janet, when you spoke about the issues, that we have to, that are completely inherently linked to the election.
So now you mentioned covering by-elections in places like Beaufort West and George, Knysna, etc. Do you pick up when you deal with communities in those places that again there are concerns and needs, and I'm talking about around political parties, understanding of electoral processes, etc., that are different compared to what you experience when you cover city politics and electoral politics in the cities? Is there that urban-rural kind of divide that we hear about when it comes to elections?
I think there are a few common issues, such as obviously the load shedding, but then you drill down and it's issues like, oh, my streetlight hasn't been working for 3 weeks now, and the day before the by-election, the mayor came and switched it on. So sometimes you hear those kinds of issues. I remember, I think it was in Swellendam in Barrydale, one of the big issues there was a lack of sports facilities for young people because the community leaders, pastors, etc., had noticed that young people are on drugs, and it was linked back to the fact not only poverty and jobs, but because there's no sports facilities. So as much as there's big issues such as load shedding, there are big issues that, my municipality can't do this or that. There are the local issues. I think in George, there was an issue about a community that had not received any housing for about 10 years, despite this being a promise by both the DA and the ANC who had governed George at the time. So it just differs where you go. I think was it Van Reinsdorp? There was the issue there was a project that was supposed to be put in place which would have helped young people to gain artisan skills. That never happened. And the community there was quite upset because, after all, it is a poor rural community.
And when you're there, how do they see your role as a journalist? Do they just moan at you, or do they think that you've got some sort of power? Are you seen as a resource for them? How do they assess your role?
I love Dorpies because you get, number one, the freshest food and the best gossip about the political leaders. But on a serious note, when you get there, because of the cuts in our newsrooms, you often hear, oh, journalist X used to come here often, but now they can't. And it's up to you now to fill that role that previous journalist used to be in and out of the community. So a lot of the times, community members we speak to are quite grateful because they will go to their ward councillor who often doesn't help them or is hampered because they may be in opposition or because the municipality is dysfunctional. They don't have access. They don't even know who the MPs are most of the time. So where are these mechanisms to help them complain or lay issues of service delivery? So in many cases, community members will actually tell you, okay, please help us with this, please help us with that. I was in Van Reinsdorp for a by-election, and every month I get the same message from the community members there. Our water's out for 3 or 4 days. Until recently, we actually discovered that there are several issues within the Matsikama municipality with regards to their water. Every month you get the same message, and it doesn't seem to change.
I wanted to just jump in on the question of the role of MPs or the presence of MPs. I mean, we don't have a constituency system, but we do have constituency officers. And it's very interesting that MPs are allocated a constituency, but that we don't relate that constituency to their work as an MP. And it's something I've always wondered is, with the proportional representation system where we're reliant on parties, how do we get better accountability on an individual level for MPs? How do we know who the MPs are, what committees they sit on, whether they're absent or present in Parliament, how they're voting, and what they're contributing? And I think even without electoral reform, if we shifted the relationship we had of citizens of South Africa to the individuals who represent us in Parliament, I think we could do something really powerful about building a stronger set of accountability from citizens to the institution of Parliament.
Yeah, Janet, thanks for raising that issue of constituencies. I think the issue of proportional representation and our current electoral system is huge, and the Constitutional Court is not going to make any decisions on the electoral amendment bill in time for it to make any difference for this election. I'm right there. And the Parliament, the ANC as a ruling party, is determined to not allow any reform to on that level, because it's just going to disadvantage the party very seriously. But this issue of proportional representation and constituency-based representation is actually critical, and that kind of electoral reform has been proposed since the days of Van Zyl-Slabbert, like, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. It's been a repeated issue. This proportional representation suits a country like ours, which is so divided and diverse and does give a voice to small groupings. But we can't not have this constitution anyway. And I worked at Parliament for many years in the information department. So I had to produce the Parliament's news magazine every month. It was the most amazing experience because, in fact, I left Parliament for this very reason. I used to try and cover the constituency work. When Parliament closes for what used to be called recess, but it's now called constituency work, I can assure you it is not constituency work unless there's an election coming up soon. Then you get parliamentarians phoning you and say, okay, we'll meet you at this point, bring your cameras, and we're going to be giving out blankets. But apart from that, there isn't any constituency work. And I got so involved in this failing of Parliament because I at one point at the time, the Secretary to Parliament denied me permission to decide which of my team can cover which areas. I was the authority, which I had always had, to actually delegate, you go out and cover that area and you go out and cover that area. I suddenly discovered I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. This was the previous Secretary to Parliament, I don't know who knows about him, but that was a shocking curtailment of Parliament, covering Parliament's constituency work. I personally, in my area where I live, for many, many, many years, thought that the office down the road from me was an ANC office because it was fully branded as an ANC office. And to my absolute shock, I discovered it was actually a constituency office. But honestly, it looked like an ANC office. So where constituencies come into this, when I was at Parliament, I actually tried to find out which MP serves each constituency, and it was an absolute mystery. I was told, well, actually, we don't have an office. We actually work out of the boot of our car. And there was, just bear in mind that at the moment, Parliament allocates funds to the parties for constituency work. Where is that money going when there are no constituency officers? And when I used to try and distribute parliamentary information to the constituencies, there was no addresses that I could actually distribute material to. So I've raised this at meetings, and the Deputy Speaker actually was at a meeting of Decode quite recently, and he spoke kind of in challenging this idea that we need a constituency system, because he said, look, we've got a constituency system at local government level. It doesn't make any difference. And that's an interesting point. It doesn't really make any difference. But to have a fully functioning constituency system that the government allows and agrees to is the point. So I think reform to form some type of proportional plus constituency level where the constituencies and the parliamentarians understand they're accountable to the people and not to the party that put them in Parliament in the first place. That was said by Zondo. It was said before Zondo. We got to keep saying it after Zondo, because to have a constituency is one thing important. To have parliamentarians who are accountable to the constituencies and not at threat of losing their seats if they go against their own party's line, which is what happens now, that is a real change that has to be made in our Parliament, and it goes deeper than just setting up constituencies that people then know who their constituency MP is. So I think those constituency issues are really important, and it's not going to affect this election. So let's start working on it now for 4 years' time.
Okay, and to bring that back into the sort of media realm, I guess there's a challenge there to the media to, in general, to be carrying out that informative and educative responsibility around these electoral reform questions. Hans, you have a question? We'll just get you a mic.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Brilliant input and I think valuable insights. Quick comment and two easy questions, I hope. On what Janet said, that those possible synergies between civil society in South Africa, which is so vibrant and very much involved in the issue of voter education, voter registration, and the cloud media houses in South Africa also have, and the freedom. Is there not a possibility to work closer together in a way when I think, for example, about Groundwork Collective or Future Elect or the Civics Academy? Yeah, there is voter education, top-notch voter education material out there. Why not? And it's freely available. Why not connecting these materials to the big media houses? Of course, that. If there's interest, I think that needs to happen now and not a month before the elections. And then the two questions on voter registration and numbers. Do you see an increase in voter registration in comparison to the last election? I think last elections were around 700,000 new voter registration. When I listen to you and about voter empathy, is it going up or rather down? I think it will matter a lot at the end. And last question, the easiest one, what's your prediction for the elections? Thank you.
All right. Anyone want to take up those questions?
Look, I think mine's absolutely in terms of partnership. I'm willing to campaign for registration. I think that's supporting democracy, and I agree with Janet that we should endorse democracy and we should endorse voting. We've got a few projects that you guys have also got a voting. I saw you launch like a nice voting platform. So I think we as media we will do that. But someone still has to click on that register button. And I don't know. This is something that gives me sleepless nights. I don't know how we get those 24 plus million people who don't vote to vote. It is a massive issue. It's a massive issue. I mean, next year's turnout is going to be as critical as the result, because we may have yet again a minority government for the majority of people. And it's just crazy to think about the numbers, that the amount of people who, for example, voted for the ANC in the last election are outnumbered by the people who didn't vote. The power is really in the hands of the people. And I mean, there's been many studies that's been done around the issue of non-voting, and there's complex reasons. It's often to do with people's literal access to voting stations and polls, to, on the other extreme, complete, not even apathy, but a protest non-vote. Someone's just saying, I protest, I will not vote. There's no one on this ballot paper who will change my life. So I think, but I think it's critical that we get more people registered. I've had meetings with the likes of Mbali from Groundwork and Lindsay Ware from Future Elect. I mean, we report on these issues. We give them publicity. We've got some of our own tools and things coming up soon on News 24. And yes, I think it is a national cause. We have to get people out there. I've in my silence, and you the first people I tell it to the other day, I was wondering, shouldn't we just have a bloody lottery for people to vote? Give R1 million to someone who voted. I mean, we have lotteries for lots of other things, but I mean, this is a pretty good cause, I think. Your other questions, what is your second question? No, I don't know. I know they, like I said, I know the likes of Mbali and them are busy. They're targeting 1 million extra voters. I know that's a number that's going around. I don't have any dates. I don't know, Sine, if you've heard how much they've actually registered, but results, come on, Hans. This is now putting us on the spot. Are you meaning results of the election? Look, I mean, I have nothing to. I mean, so I'll give you what the polls say. That the two latest polls, the one by the Brenters Foundation and the other by France Cronje Social Research Foundation. I think France is very good with polling. By the way, I think he's probably one of the best we have. So France's latest poll puts the ANC on 45, the DA on 31, and the EFF on 12. The Brenters, for interest sake, puts the ANC on 41, DA on 24, I think. So I don't think. I think the biggest at the moment, it seems to me like the ANC will settle in the high 40s. And may even with a big election push in the month before voting day, ground level campaigning, as the ANC is very good at doing, and they've got a very energetic Secretary General now in Balula, may even get to 50. I just think the opposition has failed to capture the imagination. I think that even this multi-party charter, I mean, they're not putting anything new on the table. It's just an amalgamation of their votes. So it's just saying together we have got more votes. I mean, what is your new? So, and I also feel for a guy like Songezo, and this is one of the hard discussions we're having in our newsroom, because people are saying, well, you guys are covering him, but why? He hasn't received one vote, and he actually won't get any votes. You know, the kind of, there's this very cynical view about politics in South Africa. You know, he's not a public figure. People don't know him. He's not a celebrity. You know, Malema is a cult leader. You know, Steenhuisen and Zille are popular. Well, you can for some, but I mean, they're well known. And I mean, I think this is also some of the hard questions we must ask ourselves, is like, you know, how much personality driven is politics? And, you know, how do we cover politics away from personalities? I think one of you said, was it you who said we shouldn't only look at it was you, Maura, that we shouldn't only look at the manifestos for this election, but look back, you know, at what has been achieved or not from 94. We tried to do it in our book, by the way. I'm not trying to punt the book, but we looked at the ANC's 1994 election manifesto and gave them a score of 40%, which I think is sparse in South Africa in matric. But so yeah, Hans, I at the moment, I have nothing to add to what the polls are showing. I mean, these people are professionals. It seems like the ANC may get around high 40s, DA mid 20s, EFF is interesting. So EFF polls high sometimes, but they've really hit the ceiling around 10, 11, 12. It seems to me. I mean, in the last local government election 2021, and I know there's a difference between the two election cycles, but they actually went down from their 2019 results if you can't tally the national number. I think the EFF has really gotten all the people that support their type of messaging and approach, and I don't think it's much higher than what they currently have. Sure.
I think, Hans, that Zibi's Rise Mzansi is actually worth watching, because I think it's a really an interesting initiative. I'm personally quite excited about it. And I think it's campaigning on social media a lot. In a reliable way. It's like talking about there are many WhatsApp groups and other groups where there's a passionate response among very young people, and I think they might surprise us. I don't know. This is such an unpredictable time, but the idea of a new party with a whole new strategy might actually grab people, because no one cares and don't want to hear any more from Steenhuisen. Actually, we don't even hear any more from Malema. In fact, even we definitely don't want to hear any from Fafkila. But this guy is new. Well, he's not new, but this is a new party with a whole new take on it. And social media, for all our concern about how unreliable it can be, is actually a very effective way of mobilizing young people. And I think they are really kind of, I follow there as a sort of old, quiet person watching from the background. I'm kind of amazed at the work that they're doing in communities, that they go out, they actually go to taxi ranks and talk to people. I don't see the other parties doing that at the moment. So maybe outside of the domain of the media, they're actually quite active. It will be interesting to find out. The other point, just one more point. One other point I wanted to make is that I sympathize with the media in the sense of being faced with the challenge of voter education. Because I know the material you're talking about, like Civics Academy, we've worked with them, and their material is fantastic, but it's not news. And I've worked on, I just think news is supposed to be something that's new, different, challenging, exciting. I'm sorry, but voter education really isn't. So in fairness, to kind of, you'd actually want like Hans Seidel to sponsor a page in your newspaper or several, or where you can run this voter education material, but it's not going to sell the newspaper and it's not going to attract advertising. So in fairness to the business of the news, voter education is not the responsibility. Well, it's not the business of news. Might be the responsibility. It's not the business of news. So that's a challenge, to make it sexy.
Yeah, just I'm coming to you in a second. Songeza Zibi, as former editor of Business Day, gives a whole new meaning to the role of the media in elections, if you think about it that way as well. One statistic that is really concerning, and we're talking about voter registration and voting, as of February this year, the age cohort of 18 to 29 in our country had 11.3 million people in that age cohort, of which in February only 3.5 million were registered to vote. So there's this huge gap of almost 8 million people. It might have changed a bit up to now. And they're the people who are voting for the future, who are just not in the process. And that's obviously a huge concern. Yes.
Yeah, so end of the week rambling question, but hopefully I'll get there. So I'm just thinking, as you were talking, I think it's worthwhile highlighting certain leaders, and what they do, like from Mzansi, and the community-based approach, and not focusing on coalitions like that. But I'm thinking of the Edelman barometer, the distrust that people have, and they have more trust in certain corporations and things than in that. So, two thoughts around that. It was the Bokke and how politicians hijacked the trophy along the way. So there's a bit of desperation there, but high populism as well. Then if I waited there at St. George's Cathedral for the book, and we've got the Arch for the Arch there with those pillars of the Constitution. Most of the copper plates have been stolen. Nobody's fixing them. Nobody knows what it means. So it comes back to the thing of, basics around the Constitution as well. What's the education around that? And maybe a last thing, being in the house of Tutu, that you noticed the portrait, if you came in, of him voting, the excitement around that. And we, together with our friends on the Hans Seidel, is developing a series on courageous leadership, and that would be around righteous anger, courageous dialogue, Ubuntu, things like that, things that's positive, but with a democratic slant as well. So who are the people out there that's worthwhile? We had the Tutus, we had many other people that people could grab onto to give them hope and tell them, okay, it's worthwhile to go there. Who's the role players now? And how do you report on them without saying it's, not objective reporting?
Interesting one. Anyone want to venture some names or find a way of dealing with it without mentioning names?
Definitely not mentioning names, but I think this this question that I started with of an endorsement of democracy is really, really powerful. And so if you had Siya Kolisi busy, saying this weekend coming up, go, here's the link to check where your voter station is, go and register. Or if we had, during COVID, every single retailer had signs up about COVID in their stores. If we had signs up in every single retail store about registration with a QR code that you could just scan, we could do something very dramatic. So I think there is extrapolating from your question, sort of, how do we make democracy all of South Africans' business? and how do we make the elections as a fundamental piece of democracy every single actor in South Africa's business. I wanted to just say, speaking of the Arch, when the Arch voted, he said it was like falling in love, which always makes me very emotional. But although young people didn't register for the previous elections, in the 18 to 24 cohort, those that did register turned out at an 80% level, which is much higher than the other cohorts. So there is something about if you can get young people registered for their first election and you can make that a really exciting idea that this is your vote in a first election, you might be able to do something to shift those numbers.
Can I just add something? So I am 28 years old. I unfortunately fall into that category of a lot of young people don't want to vote. And I think from the last two elections, 2019 and 2021, what I've noticed is a lot of young people, they want to vote, but the politicians and the parties are not the ones that they would like to vote. And that is a bridge that we need to get over. And I don't know how we can do that. As a young person, I don't know what I'm going to do next year. Should I vote? I would like to vote, but what am I voting for? And if you speak to young people today, my friends, they're like, why should we vote? That is the big thing we need to ask ourselves within the media, within civil society, within the education space. Because let's be honest, when you look back at your education system in life orientation, they only teach you about the Bill of Rights and that we have an election every 4 years. Nothing else. They don't tell you why you should vote. They tell you people fought for the right to vote, which we are very appreciative for. But why should we? Who should we vote for? What are the values? What are the ethics we need to understand? And once we bridge that gap, I think South Africa could be in a much better place.
Thanks, Sine. I think one possible answer there, of course, is that people shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that they're going to find a politician that makes them really happy on all counts. There's got to be this thing called strategic voting, that you might have to hold your nose and vote for someone you really dislike, but because the other options are worse, or because you're going to achieve something in the long run, or whatever. But this is not so much about voter education. There is a question in the Q&A that's linked to this. I think, Adrian, you may have raised the point around the reduction in the budget of the IEC. And there's a question about what impact this is likely to have on the elections. As you said, the IEC is a world-class organization which delivers really credible elections year in and year out. Is that possibly under threat for financial reasons?
Look, I think it's two different things. So I think the IEC is a very professional institution with world-class experts who run it, and I really don't think the election can just be rigged by a call of a politician. I really honestly think it won't happen. Or if there's attempts to do that, it will come out immediately. But the budget cut is concerning. Janet Urum here too, and I think registration for me, I was saying to Hans earlier this morning, I would expect by now to have like massive campaigns, like all over the media, digital, radio, television. I see a few posters from 2 or 3 parties, It's now online. You can now online register to who's doing this. We aren't this in our faces every single day already, So I think they've got serious cuts there in marketing budget, in ad spend. That is very concerning, because as everyone has pointed out, basically, that could make the change, is that turnout. Otherwise, we're looking at another similar looking election result than that we've become used to. So I think, and it's also good for democracy, whether irrespective of who wins, it's good that more people vote. So I think for me, I would have expected by now much more aggressive marketing, advertising, activation campaigns. Now it's up to Mbali Ntuli, bless his soul, to kind of get money from the private sector to hold parties in KZN, etc. That's great. It's great that she's doing that, but it's actually the IEC's job, the government's job. So you read what you want to in that. The fact that the IEC's budget was cut, I think it's bad. But also, thank goodness there are people like Mbali who's doing the job.
Just to respond to a couple of other points that have come up on the Q&A, the director of our organization, Father Peter John Pearson, is saying that agrees wholeheartedly with the issues that you've raised around xenophobia being or going to be a central ideological issue and a canvassing issue next year, and it needs to be watched very carefully. I'm sure the media will do that. And then there's a question about the 3 ballots and asking whether there's time for someone on the panel to inform people about these 3 ballots. If any of you feel capable of doing that, you're welcome. I mean, in general terms, as I think Moira pointed out, the thing is still sitting in the Constitutional Court. We're still waiting for finality about how all of this is going to work next year. And I'm sure that we as an organization, and probably some of the other civil society groups here, will be doing events and publishing papers and whatnot to try to explain once we have certainty about how it's all going to work with independent candidates, etc. But I don't think we're really in a position to give any definitive answers to that right now. And then the last question, which looks to the future, I'm going to leave to the end, about how the influence and the health of the free press in this country is going to develop as the years go by. But we'll wrap up, I think, with that one. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I've just got a follow-up question to your point, and I think this is quite a very serious thing to think about around the availability of capital to actually run the campaigns that we need, not only from the IEC point of view, but I've noticed that I think even the political parties have a very, very major constraint in how they can actually roll out their campaigns. So I'm quite interested in what you're thinking around the role of philanthropy, but also the role of high net worth individuals and the role of corporates in actually availing resources and availing capital in enabling the strengthening of this, very important democratic exercise. And I think also to this point, also want to ask Janet on the same point, is how is it that the Desmond Tutu and Leah Legacy Foundation is able to hold spaces like this, yet we don't necessarily see similar activism from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Oliver Tambo Foundation. I know the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation tries to they did something quite recently, which is quite remarkable around policy. But how can you as a foundation collaborate, but also how can you share your ability to have collaborative efforts on conversations that actually do matter?
Your first question was for Adrian, was it?
Look, I was chuckling the other day when I read the ANC's Treasurer General Gwen Ramokgopa said the party's now got enough money again. So it seems like things have been going better at Lutulia House. Look, I think that the party funding bill, I am a huge fan of it. I think it's hugely important. I do hear the political parties, and this is where all of them agree, right? Is that they all suffered because people stopped giving their money now that they have to declare. I think it's good. I think we have to declare donations, and I think we shouldn't shame. A big lesson for our newsroom was it's not just because someone donates money to a political party, there's nothing wrong in that. It's not an act of wrongdoing. Just because we've got such a terrible history of political party corruption doesn't mean a law-abiding citizen giving money to a political party is an act of wrongdoing. No, it isn't. But if you look at the donations over the past 2 years, there's basically 3 or 4 individuals who fund political parties. Patrice Motsepe, Michiel Leroux. So Patrice funds across parties, so he funds the ANC, and he gives proportionally, so the ANC gets more, but he also pays to the DA, the EFF, and I think number 4, 5, and 6. Michiel Leroux funds the DA, the founder of Capitec. He's the main and largest donor to the DA. And the Oppenheimer family, the daughters, I think. And then there's the Martin Mushal, who's interesting. He made his money through online lottery and gambling. He's a billionaire businessman from Durban. He funds Action SA. So he's the largest funder of Action SA. And then you've got the Oppenheimer daughters, and of course the ANC through the Victor Vexelberg co-owned mine, the manganese mine, through Chancellor House, the ANC's little mining operation in the Northern Cape. So, and those are really like the biggest funders of politics in South Africa. It's like a handful of people. So it isn't good. It's not sustainable. It's not healthy. They do get a lot of money from Parliament as well, the parties who are represented in Parliament. I know the likes of Action SA are very bitter that they're not yet entitled to that pot of money because it's a lot of money. But I agree with you. I think political parties should be funded. They should be funded. People should put their money where their mouths are. You know, I know people like Songezo, Mashaba, Musi have been going around the world to raise money to campaign because it costs money. It costs money to fight elections. What was the second question around?
Question.
One of the things I'm always very grateful about in representing the Tutu Legacy Foundation is that the Arch wasn't party political. And I think that gives us a mandate and a flexibility to convene in a different way than a Nelson Mandela or Oliver Tambo or Thabo Mbeki Foundation has the mandate to do just because of the party political affiliation. So I think we are really trying to explore what is our convening power for the kind of dialogues that we need to have as a country. We are working with the other foundations to try and build a collective, a collective influence on the election in the sense of having some gravitas to engage with, for instance, big business, with the media, to really build this almost a coalition of foundations for democracy. So really, really positioning that work. But yeah, my great joy is that the Arch was both not a party politician, but also willing to speak out on every single issue, no matter where his loyalties may have lain.
I also think very important in this country is the role of the religious leadership across the board. They played a really important part in the 94, in the 80s, in the run up to the first democratic election. I don't know the state of their capacity, but I believe they are capacitated sufficiently to come to the party. Sorry, that's not an intended pun, but I also think that when they get together, for example, there's moves now mobilizing around the genocide in Gaza, and there are moves for the across the board for all the churches, mosques, synagogues to come together, and other religions as well. And that is such a strong mobilizing force in our country because so many people would listen to their religious leader. So I would appeal to them to come come on board with mobilizing people to register and to vote, not to take political, not to say what to vote for, but to register and to vote, because I think they have huge influence, especially in the rural communities, where, although that's an ANC stronghold, the rural area, but that's, I think we must appeal to them to help. I'm sure they will.
Just on that point, Maura, there was an interesting statement. I found it 2 days ago from the National Church Leaders Consultation. I don't know if you saw this. It's a body of very representative church bodies that have now called on churches not to give politicians platforms during the election campaign, not to open the pulpits, which is very interesting because that typically has been a strong point for the ANC and others.
I don't know if anybody remembers, but during the taxi strike, when all these different stakeholders were not getting along, the church leaders from different faiths actually met at St. George's Cathedral. And the pictures out of there with the mayor and the taxi leadership, while they were fighting, while they were disagreeing publicly, in that moment, that was quite a beautiful picture. And if we could actually do something like that again, that would be powerful.
On the role of the faith communities, we've got to be careful. It's all very well for religious leaders like that to call on churches not to give platforms to party politicians, but that then gets exaggerated into don't allow your facilities to be used for election purposes, etc. And then particularly, and we've had experience of this in rural areas and places where church facilities, infrastructure is best placed could be a voting station or something. You get some denominations or pastors saying, no, it's politics. So you've got to be careful about that. Yeah, maybe. You have a question?
As well, in terms of voting, is the diaspora vote. So South Africans that are outside of South Africa, and how essentially, what kind of access to information do they have about the manifestos in the country, but also on the day of voting, what proximities do they have in actually turning out and voting on the day. So I'm interested in anyone in the panel who's maybe given some thoughts around South Africans that are living abroad and their role of participation in strengthening our democracy.
I'm guessing News 24 has quite a large number of hits from South Africans living overseas.
Look, I don't have that exact number in my mind, but no, of course. I know the DA has been pretty active in campaigning abroad. They've got a branch in the UK now. So absolutely. I think parties will go out and fight for every vote next year. It's going to be one of those elections. I say fight very lightly. I hope not fight, but
Moira, you raised the question of what's happening in Gaza. And I know you can't see my laptop screen, but there is a question about that from my boss, so I have to put it to you. He's being provocative today. Do you think that the war in Gaza will make any difference in terms of growth or loss of support for local political parties here, which are seen to be supporting Israel or sympathetic to Israel? There's a campaign afoot suggesting withdrawal of support. Any comment on whether that kind of an issue is going to have an impact on our party political situation?
I think the situation in Gaza, and in fact the sort of struggle since 1948 for the Palestinians is an incredibly emotive issue, and it hits South Africans very, very hard because there's elements about land and oppression and violence on the part of the authorities that really resonate with a lot of South Africans. A very, very divisive issue. And it's definitely affecting the political landscape now as a small but very vocal and quite powerful constituency around the Jewish Board of Deputies, for example, has come out very strongly against the ANC's position on Gaza. And I'm sure that vote, which would have been a lot of Jewish official support for Ramaphosa, that is going to be questioned very definitely. And I think I'm interested to see the ANC is risking that vote. It's to me very interesting. It's interesting time to be doing that. I think if they hadn't, though, they'd be risking losing a much bigger vote. So I think the political party stances on Gaza, the war now, and the struggle for Palestine liberation is huge in South Africa, and it will affect. It depends whether the parties are going to go for it. But with the war going on as it is. And I don't know, they seem to be in for the long haul, which is frightening. But I don't see it going away, and I don't think any party will be able to remain allegedly impartial indefinitely. So if it's brought onto the political debate, I think it has the capacity to really affect a lot of people. It will strongly on either side, for or against each party, depending on the position they take. That is my feeling. I think the parties and the organizations involved would like to avoid that, but the communities, the constituencies, the voters will demand that kind of question, and the answers will affect them, I do think.
So I think it was about 2 weeks ago that the Patriotic Alliance, one of the parties that we might need to have a closer look at in the lead up to the elections, the leaders were at a Stand with Israel protest, picket, demonstration. The wording was a bit vague. So they had expressed complete support for the Israeli state. And if you check their Facebook comments, the Muslim community within the Patriotic Alliance have said, cancel our memberships. Straight up, they said, we can't be in a party that supports Israel. And that I think that's something we need to just keep an eye out, who's leaving parties and why.
Yeah, it's a very new thing, I think, in fact, for South Africa that issues of our government's foreign policy and our political parties' foreign policy positions could actually have an electoral effect. I don't really think we've been there before. Maybe over the years on Zimbabwe, it's come up as a point of criticism of the governing party over the years. But one can also add into this, obviously, Ukraine, Russia, and the stance that the government has taken on that. I think that might also end up costing the ANC a few votes. I'm going to start wrapping up at this stage. But do you have a question? No? We don't have any further questions on the Q&A, except for the one that I said I'm going to come to. I'd like to just remind the online audience to please take a moment to download that link for the evaluation form. You know how all that works. And just fill in that little survey. It takes you about 1 minute, maybe 1 minute, 20 seconds to do it. So I hope that you will. The last question to deal with, looking towards the future, and in particular the future of the media. Our friend as the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office friend, Professor Jan Jans, who joins us from Belgium very faithfully for these meetings, says you cannot cook without ingredients, and you cannot have a free press without the material and financial means of supporting that press. How is this going to develop in South Africa? I'm going to ask all of you, I think, to give your thoughts, and I'll come to Adrian at the end. Janet, what do you think the future holds for our press in terms, is it going to survive?
I'm no expert, but I guess it has to survive. And we've got to figure out as a society, the business side of the media needs to figure out how it can thrive and survive. I think we need to not lose sight of the SABC. I think we have to really understand that the vast majority of South Africans get most of their news and coverage from the SABC. And so in discussions about what role media plays, they have to be a critical part of that conversation. And that needs to be shaped in really interesting ways. But how the business of media manages to keep up with the challenges of a changing climate, I will defer to my journalist friends here.
Look, I think that media, like many sectors of society, are going through a difficult financial period at the moment, and we can't separate ourselves from any other industry. What I do think is people need to start supporting media, whether it's just reading articles, becoming members of publications, supporting anyway, if there's events happening, all those things happen. Share articles, yes, go ahead. If journalists who work at publications are writing books, support them. If there's events, some of them are free, some of them are not. Support them. We all need support in this very, very difficult time right now.
Moira.
Thanks. I agree with what my friends here on the panel have said. There's also what I think is a need for the media to change. Not only to change because there's a global financial crisis, but there's a need to change to accommodate the new technology, the social media, and the challenges. The challenges are not only financial to the conventional press that's been around for hundreds of years. The challenges are greater because the young people and the people of the future get the information from other sources, free sources. So I think that kind of change is necessary, and it's up to the media. It's not only a financial crisis. It's a change in information gathering and a change in the communication sphere that has to be acknowledged. I don't know if the media is able to or has been doing that, but what I would like to say with regard to this debate is Adrian at the very beginning brought up the need to use investigation as an important news tool. Anybody now who has internet can come up with information that they want to share. The important thing is that information now has to be investigated truth checked, fact checked, and I think the media has must establish its position again as it used to once be a provider of reliable information. And in this world of overwhelming amounts of information, a lot of it absolute rubbish, I think the media has to really stand up to this and say, okay, if you really want to know what's happening, come to the people who do the fact checks. And that is as important as any other way of looking forward to the media in the future.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to panelists for the input. I agree. I think that supporting us through a subscription or through a membership or through a newspaper purchase is the way to go. Look, there is light at the end of the tunnel, I want to believe, in the positive note. So 20 years ago, News24 was a much smaller operation. It was an aggregation platform. There was no such thing as Daily Maverick. Today, I would argue they are the two leading newsrooms in the country. So there is something to celebrate as well. I think the fact that most investigative pieces in South Africa and the best journalism in South Africa today is produced online is a great kudos to what we and our colleagues have built. It is sad to see some media houses like the Independent Group completely breaking down. I mean, we can have a whole session on why that's happening. But there are others filling the void. There's other people coming into the space, stepping up with innovative models like membership models, like online subscriptions. So please support all of us if possible. It's not expensive. It's really not.
Thank you very much. So just to wrap up, we have a strong and free media, and you've seen some of their representatives here this morning to demonstrate that. We have strong and free and very active civil society organizations doing all sorts of wonderful work. We have free and fair elections on a regular basis every 5 years, very professionally run. We've got a whole range of political parties to suit every taste, just about every taste. And now we're going to have independent candidates to choose from as well. So what's the problem? Democracy, on paper at least, is alive and well. But it's definitely in our hands, and that seems to be the message that I get from so many of these occasions. We can complain and we can moan about the things that go wrong in our country, and we have good cause to do that. But the solutions remain in our hands. Yes, we need to talk to people, we need to educate people, we need to spread the word about all of these things, and let's do that. This is part of that effort. Thank you very much for joining us, the online audience. There were 25 people online, by the way. So the dozen or so of you here in the room, don't feel that lonely. Thanks to the panel, Moira Levy from the Institute for African Alternatives, Janet Jobson from the Desmond Hilaire Tutu Legacy Foundation. And Janet, thank you for physically hosting us here in this wonderful building. Sune Payne from the Daily Maverick, and Adrian Basson, editor-in-chief of News24. I must also thank the Hans Seidel Foundation, in particular Marlene Barnard, who's been working with me on organizing this event. My colleague at the CPLO, Sue Doherty, who does all the background work to make these things happen. Hans Bühler is the local representative of the Hans Seidel Foundation in South Africa, also gives us a lot of guidance in what we do and the topics that we choose and so on. And to all of you who've joined us this morning here, thank you very much.